My name is Grace Braniff. I'm the curator of Disorientations, and today we're here talking with artist Ekene Emeka Maduka. Thank you so much for coming in to talk to me about your work.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
Okay, so first off, we're in front of one of Ekene's works, which is Morning Assembly, and I'd love if you could just give us a little bit of information or talk a little bit about your experience that led to making this work.
So this is probably the longest piece that I've worked on. So I started making this work in 2020, and when I was thinking of making this work, I was kind of thinking about my experience going to boarding school. I think I like to play with sort of ideas of childhood and memory, and especially when it's around the ages of like teenage, adolescent sort of ages.
The coming of age experience.
Exactly, the coming of age experience. I like to sort of talk about that because I think they're very formative years. And also the way that we remember things, at least for myself, what I was thinking of is how skewed those memories become over time. Some of them might even be false, the way that we remember things, and for each person it's sort of like different. I will say, it is funny that I've done my hair this way.
Oh.
Because this is actually like a hairstyle that in a morning assembly, which is the title of the piece, they would sort of assign hairstyles in the boarding school that I went to. And this would be one of the hairstyles that they would sort of say, this week we're doing all back. And
Whoa.
So that kind of reminds me of like being at an assembly in the morning.
Okay, and the idea of your hair being part of the uniform, you're wearing a uniform.
Exactly.
And like your whole aesthetic is wrapped into that.
Exactly.
Looking the sameness.
Yeah,
kind of.
exactly.
So can you talk a little bit more about the facial expressions or the emotions and how they relate to those memories?
So when I made the assembly line, again, we're talking about uniform, we're talking about the experience of being in school, which is really what I was sort of unpacking. And I think at the time that I started making the work, I wasn't even yet sure what I was unpacking.
Yeah.
So I think you can see that sort of shift through time.
And I love the multiple faces as being unsure of what you're unpacking and just including kind of all the multitudes of that
different
experience.
Emotions. Yeah, exactly. There is an episode actually of The Crown where Prince Charles goes to Gordonston, I think is what the school's called. And it's like a British boarding school. And actually it was pretty much this.
Okay.
And it makes a lot of sense because Nigeria was colonized by the British. And I don't know if currently boarding schools in England would still sort of have kind of the traditions or like the sort of corporal energy that a lot of the boarding schools in Nigeria still have. But it was very interesting to sort of see that like, oh, this is where it comes from. But in the moment, I think while you're in it, you don't really know where it comes from. You just think like, oh, this is sort of like my experience. But then I think it opens up so many different layers. And I think at the time, speaking of facial expression, I think at the time when I was sort of unpacking that, there's one character in particular, this one.
Yeah.
I think the rest of them have this sort of uniform expression, but this one's sort of like upset.
Out.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think I was thinking of things like, we'd have to wake up at like 4 a.m. to like get ready for the day, and this was like a normal. It was very much about discipline and routine.
Yeah.
And I think those are also very colonial, sort of like principles. But it was interesting because it was also very like grounding in a way, and that was sort of when I watched that episode of The Crown. That was sort of like what they were trying to like show, which is very interesting. So it's a lot of these, kind of. It's very layered experience. And I think with, so I think these two actually, I finished this part of the painting very recently actually. And so it's interesting to see that shift, that at this point, I almost want the viewer to, I feel where these expressions are, layered and sort of like, you could almost in some way pinpoint a few more emotions here, whereas this one, like you rightfully pointed out, it's very stark. They almost look solemn and calm, and you're trying to figure that out. So I wanted there to be a bit of like ambiguity to what they're feeling.
Yeah, and like almost like acceptance, whether good or bad, or feeling still negatively about it, but like an acceptance of this experience having happened is kind of what I was getting from that. we are here in front of Ekene's second work within the show. This is Fly on the Wall of the Home Ec Lab. And something I've noticed about folks coming to this piece is that they immediately point out the little flies that are adhered in different locations around this installation work. And I was thinking about the phrase you have written backwards here on the painting side. One's a mirror, the other side is a canvas or a painted board, and it says "memory of a memory of tasting things." And I was thinking of those senses and how those senses play into our ability to remember experiences, and those kind of persistent things that come up through our memories that make it impossible for us to forget that. And I was kind of thinking about that as the fly kind of nattering at you constantly, and the physicality of that experience. Can you talk a little more about it?
Absolutely. I think you've sort of really framed it so beautifully and so well. And it makes me really happy, I have to say, that you kind of got all of that from like the work, because I think that's really what I was channeling and thinking of. When I was making the piece, I thought it would be really interesting, like, you know, it's nice to have this sort of Easter egg where, you know, you kind of have to, you know, like unlock a memory or like unlock reading the statement by looking at the mirror. And then, you know, with the flies, it's also really funny. Again, like satire. It's like, is that a fly? Yeah. You know, it's like, and I got those on Amazon.
I also feel like the fly existing in like the white, like institution, the White Cube Gallery, a space that isn't devoid of smells or memory, but like postures to be kind of like sterile in some way. Yeah. And the idea of like talking about smells and thinking about flies in this place, I feel like asks a question of the building itself in some ways. And in terms of disorientations, one of the reasons I was really pulled towards your work was that kind of, you do work a lot with self-portrait and portraiture, and this kind of grappling with the many versions and histories of ourselves, and how that is like a unsettling experience to visually encounter, but an unsettling experience within ourselves. And I think with a lot of the works in this exhibition, they ask something from the viewer to finish the work, kind of. Yeah. And I think in your expression and the different faces you're making or you've painted to have in this, you're asking something of the viewer to bring themselves into it, and I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. A funny thing about working with my, like, you know, with self-portraiture is, I will tell you, like people recognize this to me, but a lot of the times, which is again this sort of thing that we're talking about, I don't actually see them as myself. Okay. Yeah, so it's really interesting. Like I know they're me. Yeah. But in some way, I kind of detach myself. And again, it's that sort of, you know, thing of like viewing your image, and I think also there's a lot of performance in it. So, you know, I think to make these works, so like when I did this in 2020, I took pictures of myself because I always have to like document myself. I think at the time I took this one, I asked a friend to help me take the pictures, and then later on I started taking pictures myself. So there's literally different people who have taken the pictures. So for the reference image that I used for this, my friend took them. And I did a lot of performance art. And I think that really helped me kind of move outside of my own body. You know, at the time I took this 4 years ago, I was thinking of like, how did it feel standing in line in an assembly? And I just had my friend like taking these rapid pictures, and then I would go back and look at them, and then I'll be like, oh, that's the one. Because if it makes me feel, you know, whatever I felt inside, like if that visual sort of facial expression. So I think because I'm so focused on the expression, what is happening in the body, there's a bit of this separation that happens where I'm almost, you know,
you're othering yourself.
I'm othering myself, exactly. So it feels very, you know, it's a weird sort of, and then, you know, taking these pictures like 4 years later, you know, I kind of was like, hey, I want this to just sort of be like, I don't even really know what I feel, but this is like, I was thinking of after the assembly or whatever time, sometimes I don't like to, like you were saying, I don't fill in the whole image. I want people to keep looking for things.
Yeah.
And I'm also looking for things.
Yeah.
So I don't really know at the time. But then the more that I look at the work after, I see other things that maybe I didn't even, pick up on. But I was thinking of hey, sometimes you're just kind of sitting down and, zoning out in the class or whatever. Is this before or after class? Is this afternoon? I don't know. Is this morning? I don't know.
Yeah.
It's kind of like this. And so taking those images, I think I even feel as a person I was probably in a different space to have made that decision.
Yeah.
And it's funny that actually I added these two figures to this canvas that I was already working on 4 years ago. I added these the same time that I added those two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like the idea also of there's the memory of the event. There's the event that happens. There's the memory of the event that's formed kind of after that. Then there's this recreating of your experience through photography. And then in this piece specifically, there's a looking back on those 3 points of entry into that experience and recreating again, and then painting that. And I like to think of the lifeline of your works kind of into the future, and as of a way of grappling with our own pasts and histories and positionality or way of working through fraud experiences or coming of age experiences. Thank you so much for coming to talk with me about your work. I think it's amazing for me to kind of be able to work through my own ideas in this exhibition and the ideas that you're thinking about when you make these works. And I think it's really amazing for guests that come to be able to hear directly from the artist and not always interpreted through the curator.